Okay, let's go ahead and talk about VHS 85, because when we went into this one, this is something that I was like super hyped for, because of course we've already talked about how much I love the anthology movie, but another thing I really love about horror is basically the entire decade of the 80s, because there was really no better decade for horror, at least I think, where it was just really no holds barred, and slashers were in their heyday, and effects were going up like a whole other level, and just everything was getting crazier. There was just like classic upon classic, and all of that obviously probably gave me some unfair hype for this movie, because I do remember coming out of it pretty underwhelmed, but maybe that was kind of self-inflicted, so let's just go through it and see if we can change that feeling by taking a better look at the segments individually. So the first segment is No Wake by Mike P. Nelson, and we were just talking about how this was like the heyday of the slashers in the 80s, so given the 80s setting, this is basically the perfect setup with the woods and the lake, and it gives you all the vibes of what to expect here. Well, the thing about it is that this segment is pretty much keen on subverting every possible expectation. So before we get to that, there probably could have been more with the character dynamic, because it seemed like they were kind of setting that up with our camera guy and Robin. And now we have this exchange where it's like he clearly likes her, and the way they trade off the camera, and the way they look at each other, and their silences. And there's something authentic about that, but then there's like no more real importance on the other characters until it's very crucial in a minute that two of them are siblings, but I feel like we barely got that vibe. But it doesn't matter, because we're setting up essentially the slasher vibe. But it does add a bit more, like, to humanize them, it does bring more emotional weight to the fact that not only are these characters ill-fated in a very peculiar way, but where this ultimately leads later as well would need more emotional weight. But again, just looking at it as purely a slasher movie, and they go out on the lake and they're doing their thing and they're doing the water skiing and all that, everybody's having fun, and then we realize that it's not a typical slasher movie when they start getting picked off. Because when you think of slashers, you think of, oh, the characters get picked off one by one, which is what happens here, but in kind of a more literal sense, I guess you could say, where somebody starts shooting at them from the shore. And as if that's not expected enough, you would think, oh, is this, like, first of all, it's like, I guess this is a horror segment. It doesn't feel like it quite fits the vibe, but I can run with this. It is a very scary situation, and they do play it up as a horror situation where they're on the boat and they're trying to stay out of the line of fire, and they're just stuck. They're just stranded on the water. And just that feeling, and the way just the terror of it takes over, and the gore, like the hard-hitting violence of the shots, and like the poor girl whose jaw gets partially blown off that she has to like hold together later. It's like it is all there, all the horror elements are there. And we even get this moment that's quite terrifying when it seems like everything is stopped, like it goes silent and the characters are whispering, and it gives you the idea of, is it over? And then when the shooting starts up again, and then we see like the point of view of our cameraman dying, and just everything feels so trapped, and like there's no way out except to die. And that's pretty terrifying. So in the way they interrupt it with this "Do you know where your children are?" ad, and like some other, like it flips to some other channel, and then it comes back to this one. And I find it really interesting the way, when they flip to another channel, it makes you think that the segment is over, and then it comes back around, and it's like, it's kind of foreshadowing that this is a segment that's repeatedly not over when you think it's over. So, and as far as, and I love when they are resurrected and they're kind of talking, kind of coming to terms with that, is this thing where it's like, it actually feels, if something this insane and fantastical were to actually happen, that this is how people would interact about it. But when you think, oh, is that it? Was that the whole segment? Because it does seem like it leaves a lot open, because it's kind of setting up like, oh, we're going to get revenge on the person who did this, and then it just ends. And the 7 on the wall. And it's like, it does feel like it leaves it, but at the same time, you could just decide that it's, oh, I guess the resurrection was the payoff of the segment. Like, that's what the big moment we were leading to was whoa, that, like, it was like this lake, the water in the lake causes immortality, and it's like, okay, that's a pretty wild payoff. And then it seems to stop there. So what's interesting about this that's very different from the rest of this series is that we do have a continuation segment with Ambrosia. And instead of waiting until we get to that point, I'm just going to talk about these together, No Wake and Ambrosia, as one segment. So, when we get this continuation later in the movie, I guess you could argue that it maybe betrays the concept of the anthology as far as the VHS franchise has set it up, where it's all the individual stories and the one wraparound. And because that's a very sort of sacred piece of the horror genre that just really works with these contained stories by themselves. But we've had, you know, other things like Trick or Treat kind of play with that a little bit, where the characters and the stories kind of intersect a little more. But this is the first time the VHS series seems to be doing it. And while you could see it as a betrayal of the concept, I do think doing it this one time, it is like a fun surprise when you realize that we're still going and that there's going to be an extra payoff to what they set up in the previous segment. And so when we see this family reunion, it is like, it does feel very authentically 80s. Like when I was talking about with the Gawkers in the previous movie, where it literally just felt like you were watching a 90s home movie. This feels the same way with the 80s, whether it's like the hairstyles or the clothes or the way people are behaving or whatever. It feels very much like of the era it's trying to emulate, which is really impressive. And then we get the moment where our sort of main girl here, who's being celebrated, gets squirted with the water gun. And I love the way they did the water gun setup, where it was used for this totally throwaway purpose in the previous segment, but also in a way that it doesn't feel like it's setting anything up when we have the water gun in the previous segment. So the part it ends up playing in this is really clever also, especially given the whole gun angle of all the terror that's going on here, where it's like from both sides some type of gun ended up being what caused the downfall of everybody. So when you're looking at this family, and it seems like this typical normal family reunion, this all seems like people you would see in like your family's photo albums or something, or home movies. And then they start going into this thing of the Seven, where there's some sort of cult, I guess you could say, and this rite of passage where every person in the family has killed 7 people to kind of grow into adulthood or whatever, and not to disgrace the family name. And when we see this video from the other side of the segment we just saw, and we see, it's like they're watching a graduation, like everybody's so happy and proud of her, and she's like mugging for the camera, and just this whole thing just has this really, it just completely gets under your skin, watching how happy everybody is here, and how much of a family tradition this is. And then this whole reveal when the cops show up, and they have like this whole arsenal under the furniture, and even the mom says like, we always had to be prepared for this to happen, it was going to happen at some point. And then there's like this absurd comedy to it as this shootout starts to take place, and we're just kind of waiting for that really big payoff because of the sadistic arrogance we've been seeing with this girl. It's going to be a very satisfying payoff when we get to the moment when the whole family has been wiped out and she's the last one. And then we realize what was in the water gun, and she's attempting to kill herself, and she just can't. And it's just this ultimate revenge, knowing that she's being taken away to whatever prison, and she's just never going to die. And it's like, that's a really satisfying payoff to the whole thing, and just a really great sort of revenge story. I don't know that they ever addressed how they knew it was her that was shooting. I feel like they were saying he a lot when they were looking for the shooter in the first segment. But I'm not going to let that take away from the satisfying payoff that is the revenge angle that we ultimately got here. So this is fun. So this next one is called God of Death, and it's by J.D. Saul Guerrero, who also plays the reporter at the beginning and end of the segment. And the setting for this one is a real-life earthquake that hit Mexico City in 1985, where like thousands and thousands of people died. So I would say it's a bold call to use this as the setting for a VHS segment, especially since we talk about a lot how a lot of these segments have this sort of fun quality to them, and that can be what the appeal of the whole franchise is. And obviously, for the most part, this one's not particularly fun. So we do start and we see like the crew messing around and joking, and we kind of get their dynamic, and then the earthquake hits pretty quickly. And while we do see like stuff falling and people crush, a lot of the earthquake effects are done through like camera movement and sound. And while that doesn't fully reach like the desired effect, I do think it's nice to see like old-fashioned techniques at use. There's almost like this nostalgic feeling of saying, "Hey, it's an earthquake," and just shaking the camera. So that's a nice way to show the filmmaking that could be done on the low budget that these franchises have, while doing really big, ambitious pieces like this one. But as we're going through the debris and all the carnage, there are moments that are pretty on the nose that kind of try to have some emotional depth, where we see like corpses and then like old footage of them alive will like bleed through. It's like I get the sentiment, but it does feel very on the nose. And when you go through and you see, it can be very harrowing the way it's done, which is great. Where we see like there's people who are just barely alive, and there's the guy that needs mercy killed, but then there's also like the people who just on sight you know that they're gone, like they just can't be helped. And so that brings in this really scary vibe as you're going through this. So we do get to a point to where they were like, well, maybe this is a little too bleak and maybe it's a little too real since we're using a real disaster and everything. So we should probably add some levity to the mix. So just kind of right here in the middle of these sequences where we're like squeezing through small areas and the claustrophobia is setting in, they throw in a fart joke. Which is, like I appreciate the idea of trying to throw in something to kind of lighten it a little bit, since it's such heavy material and it's being treated relatively seriously. But if a fart joke is the choice, you're probably better off just committing to the bleakness by that point. But shortly after this, we do get to a much needed level of crazy finally comes into the segment, where one of the characters is possessed by an Aztec god, who then proceeds to rip out his own insides and then kill another guy. And then it becomes like this claustrophobic gore bath that has, it starts to feel like a VHS segment at this point, which is fun. But then we have a little epilogue here where it does bring us back down to, this was a real disaster. This is a day that many are going to remember forever. And it's like, just when we were starting to have fun with all the gore and the possession and the Aztec gods and all that, it's like, it's a very jarring transition back to reality. And it's like, I imagine there is a way to blend outlandish horror and real life horror. I'm not saying it's like impossible, but it is very tricky, and the outlandish horror does work in this one quite well. So there is an opening, but here I don't think it really meshes very well, and we just end up with a lot of really mixed feelings. So this next segment by Natasha Kermani is about a one-woman show that more or less ends up being a one-woman segment, where this performance artist is on stage and talking about technology's new place in the world, and in 1985, so as it continues to grow, it is something that's sort of nice and relevant 40 years later where we are now. And she's on stage and she's talking about how we've essentially killed the religious god as we know him and replaced him with this god of technology. And there's a lot of interesting ideas in this one where treated to this whole sequence where this presentation where this guy's talking about being able to interact physically with the digital dimension. And he talks about, there's a little bit of a clever bit where his sort of VR goggle type thing he refers to as his iPhones, and then that brings us to the moment later where she's talking about technology taking over the world and taking over us and our reliance on our iPhones. So it's like it's kind of a double meaning with today's technology versus that, which is kind of fun. And there's also this interesting thing she goes into about this with this god of technology being a new god. It would be a god that's young and like a child, and like just now experiencing whatever world we've set them up in as we've created them. So there is some pretty big ideas in this one, but it is ultimately a pretty simple segment that comes to a pretty simple conclusion, where we do come to our gruesome finish. And I guess it's up for interpretation as to what this could mean, whether it be like too much reliance on technology can be dangerous, or consequences for playing God, or something like that. But it's basically just a whole lot of build-up to get to the moment where she is thrown around on stage and ripped apart and de-skinned and all of that. And ultimately leading up to the obvious punchline of everybody thinks it's part of the show and starts clapping. So there's really not much to this one, and it's one that I kind of forgot about coming back into this one. And so, yeah, there's really big ideas in here, but it doesn't really seem to... It just kind of presents them and then just kind of finishes without really saying too much, I think, about what it was really building up to begin with. So now we can go on to the final segment, and of course when this one was coming out, this was the one that had all the hype behind it, because it's Scott Derrickson coming back to the universe of the Black Phone. The main setup being that the kid Gunther is cousins with Finney and Gwen and has the same power that Gwen did, where she could see the murders through her dreams. And as far as aesthetic, there is also something here. Those really cool shots in the Black Phone, when we would see like visions and it would look like really old film, that aesthetic returns a lot, especially when we're seeing the dreams through like the VHS quality. So that's a lot of fun. And bringing in this investigative aspect with these detectives, Freddy Rodriguez and James Ransone. James Ransone's presence here might be confusing to some people, given that he also played the Grabber's brother in the Black Phone and took the axe to the head. But he's also like kind of a Scott Derrickson staple, so otherwise you just kind of expect him to pop up regardless. So that's fun anyway. And yeah, talking about how the dreams are shown in this and the way the dreams are recorded, like on the tapes, that is kind of a bit of a convoluted setup, I think, but it's easy enough to we can just go ahead and roll with it. Giving everything else that's going on here, we can just accept whatever comes our way as far as the setup goes. But seeing these killings, especially through the VHS quality, and the point of view killer scenes, where we see like the black gloves and just the graphic nature of it, of like the eye slicing and stuff like that. I love what appears to be a pretty intentional giallo vibe, I imagine is what he was going for, and it really captures that, especially with that score, where it like the score that also it feels evoked from the previous movie, where it's a score that just like crawls along in this really eerie way, and there's like the distorted audio. Like I said, the graphic nature of this one's a lot more gruesome than the Black Phone was, where we see like the dismembered body and the skinning and all that, and it's I mentioned it again, but again, to not downplay it, the eyes are the worst. So taking all that into account, and then doing the investigative aspect of it, where we see Freddy Rodriguez doing his police work, and we see like the interrogation of Gunther, there is a good vibe here as far as it being like a bit of a detective story also, which does lead us to this really interesting twist where it turns out that Bobby is not on the force anymore, and he's connected to all these victims through allegations that were pressed against him, leading to this very surprise death of Freddy Rodriguez's character, and taking us into our climax. And it does feel like this it's appropriate that this is the final segment, because this does feel like the climax of a movie and not just necessarily a short segment. Albeit, it's a pretty messy ending, like of James Ransone being able to take out like an entire police station and this whole thing. But still, it does feel like a nice big climax that we've built to. So, yeah, this one does have a lot going for it, even if it can be a bit convoluted and messy. Still, just seeing Scott Derrickson go back to this world and bring us that aesthetic. And, of course, I'm shooting this before the Black Phone 2 has come out, so by the time you're seeing this, I'll know there'll probably be a video on the Black Phone 2 out. And so revisiting this world is something that's really interesting and opens up a lot of doors, and I'll be really curious when that movie comes out, that as of this time I haven't seen yet. I'll be interested to see what else they do with it there as well. But yeah, it's just kind of fun coming back here. So as far as the wraparound story, which is called Total Copy, and is by, the great David Bruckner, who's also a veteran of the series at this point, we have these sort of very brief teases for a while, where it's this sort of documentary about the finding of this creature, this inhuman creature that looks like a featureless child that they name Rory, who can basically mimic forms, it seems. And much like the rest of the wraparounds, we get little teases as it goes on for a while, but then at about the halfway mark here, we do introduce this character that's played by Kelly Garner, who does start to add some weight to this and some ominous vibes to it, where we're focusing on the doctor in charge, Spratling, and she's speaking about him in the past tense and saying ominous things like he never knew when to not pick up the snake and he didn't deserve what happened to him. And it's kind of at this point that it starts to build up, like it's ramping up to something of how is this going to end, and are we going to see what this horrible, terrible thing was that happened. And in between, she's, throwing out some big ideas out there, like, we care about us, but existence itself doesn't, and we treat other intelligent life horribly, and who's to say it wouldn't do the same thing to us if it had the chance. And looking at ideas like that, and that's opening up something in regards to, like, tampering with other forms of life, and what we do as humans, and how just inherently destructive we tend to be, especially with nature. And so, there's a little something in there, but there's also these continuations of this study, and as things become more, the things that Roy's capable of become more impossible, like how he can start morphing into somebody he's never seen or met before. And they throw in little humorous moments, like when Spratling says, "Do you want to see it again?" And the camera lingers on Gary, and the narrator says, "Gary did not want to see it again." So that's very funny, and very much needed as this segment starts to kind of really take itself seriously. And by the time we get to the end of it, they are really still building up what exactly happened, where the host of this show talks about the disturbing nature of the images, and for the well-being of the viewers, we can't show you what happened. And so there's a great cut where as soon as he says that and he builds up that it will basically ruin your life if you see it, there's an abrupt cut, and it says, "This is the raw footage, this is what they don't want to show you." And what this was all building up to was that everybody that stuck around was killed by tentacles. And that's basically the extent of it. So, there's some moments in there, like the point of view shot where he's being dragged away and down the hallway and into the other room. And when the bodies are being manipulated into the exercise moves that were in the exercise videos Roy's been watching this whole time. There is kind of a fun and funny, disturbing nature to that. But overall, if the question is, was it worth a whole movie's worth of build-up? Just not really. So as far as ranking, I think I am going to put TKNOGD at the bottom, where it does have some really good ideas and seems to want to expand on a lot of things. But it is also interesting how a segment that presents such big ideas can ultimately feel so insignificant and forgettable. So that's unfortunate. Then I think next we're going to go God of Death, which, yeah, is bold to use the real-life disaster, but it doesn't really find its footing until it decides to go much more over the top, rather than the grounded nature it kind of started with and tries to end with, just leaving everything really mixed and kind of a weird feeling at the end of the day, too, and not necessarily the good kind. Then I guess second we'll go Dreamkill, where obviously Derrickson does have an unfair advantage with being an established director and being in an already established world that he's already worked in and kind of built. But the vibes, especially like the Giallo vibes and the investigative vibe, there's so much that is working here, even though it is kind of messy and convoluted at the same time also, but the world is still very much appealing and the aesthetic is very, very much appealing. So, at the top, that would put No Wake and Ambrosia, which, again, is just a really fun experiment to sort of split up the segment and set up something that could work on its own, but then also has a later sort of unexpected payoff where it starts off quite scary and then turns surreal and explosive and ultimately satisfying. So, that's how I'd put those. I do think it's a pretty underwhelming lineup, especially with, like I said, the 80s being such a good place for something like this. But it does seem like they kind of went in a bit of a different direction than you might think when you think 80s horror and what this could have been. But as far as their approach goes, there's stuff that works here, and there's a lot of them have like those sort of big ideas I'm looking at, especially the wraparound segment. Really kind of tries to delve into like humanity and all that other stuff, but it's, yeah, as far as like the rest of the series, it's not one of my favorites, but we do still have two more to go with Beyond and the brand new one, Halloween, so we'll talk about those, and then we'll go on to all the other things, like more, I don't know what's left at this point. There's probably a Poe and Price or two left, there's probably a Stephen King original versus remake, a franchise, and we've still got a little bit to go, but we're getting there. So until the next thing, I think that's it.